through December. So we're back on schedule. Hopefully we'll stay there. Thank you all for being here. Our next event, all of you who are members should have gotten in your email a schedule for the spring here at the museum. If you did not, and you're a member who gets your news through the mail, hopefully you'll get it this week. Those of you who are on the email address and are members and didn't get them, if you let us know, we'll try to get you on that list. But in addition, there are some copies over on this table and at the front desk of our upcoming events, so you can pick one up there. Our next event is in recognition of Black History Month, and we are pleased to have Charity Eldera, who was a graduate of JMU, who did research on the Afro-American population of the Broadway area right after the Civil War, and it is a very well-documented research project that I hope you'll come and hear. Today, we're just really happy to welcome back Pat. All of you know Pat, and you know that she is by far the best speaker we could ever find to talk on Western Plains District. She is, of course, our resident historian, and she's published so many books on the history and family histories and what have you. And we're just delighted to have her here today. Thanks for coming, and we're just glad you're here.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Helen. I appreciate that. Well, welcome everybody. Before I get started, I want to introduce my 8th grade American history teacher, Mr. James Rush, back in the corner. And he had us do projects like oral histories of our grandparents that included Civil War soldiers and also some other topics like that. So that got me started on oral histories, and I'm still using some of the information that I collected from those oral histories even today. So thanks a lot again, Mr. Rush. Now, let's see. Is that picking up? Can you all hear me all right? Okay. Western Plains District is Brock's Gap. It's about 150 square miles and takes in the villages of Forks Run, Burton, and Criers. Today I'm going to talk about the early history of all of Brock's Gap, the post offices, some of the businesses, and a little bit of family history. Now, the geographic name for Western Plains is Brock's Gap, and the actual gap is the gap in the Little North Mountain Range that you can see here in my brother Ron's picture. I think I'm going to take this off and hold it. Okay, whoops. All right, the name of Brock's Gap was familiar to everybody in the whole area long before there were any post offices that I just named off. You might know the actual gap from the pictures I just gave you a preview of. From Benny's Beach, we called it in my day, or Brock's Gap Service. This is a picture of that store when Ray B. Wine owned it in the 1940s. And then this is a picture when Benny had it, Benny Carr. He was a World War II soldier. And then this is the way I remember it the most, more like in the 1970s. Now we'll get back in time. The first land grant that I found for any place that I could identify as being Brock's Gap was in 1734/1735. That's when the calendar system changed, so that's why it's written that odd way. 800 acres was surveyed for land developer Benjamin Borden. That was so early that the gap wasn't in Rockingham County, it wasn't in Augusta County, but it was in Orange County, Virginia. So at that early days, you'd have to go to Orange County to find this survey. Sorry, getting used to the mouse on this pad here. The survey for the 800 acres took in much bottomland, especially along the North Fork, right there, the North Fork, and what we call the Shoemaker River. And of course, one of the landmarks was Chimney Rock in that very first survey. Later on, not too much later on, Thomas West moved in. I think he first lived on Runyon's Creek, and then he bought land in Burton and lived at Burton. Bernard McHenry owned land at Clover Lick, which is close to Yankeetown. And I've been told by one of his descendants that he had a trading post in Brock's Gap. Now, Chimney Rock has been admired and venerated by generations and centuries of local people. And yes, somebody did stand on his head. You have a picture of it back here, too. In 1913, Harry Weatherholt stood on his head on Chimney Rock. Now, when I was younger, I wondered, well, why would people want to settle on Brock's Gap when it's so far away from Harrisonburg and from out in town, and there's better farmland out here in the main valley? Why would they choose Brock's Gap? Well, one reason was, I'm sure, was water. There were a lot of springs in Brock's Gap, and the streams would made it handy to carry your water in for the animals and carry it in for your house. And then the streams had fish in that you could provide food for your table. And then the streams became rivers, which had water power for the mills and grist mills and sawmills that were later sprung up. And you can see from this picture, my dad, the good water also powered some distilleries. This was Captain George Falk's Spring at Falk's Run, and it was legal when he was doing it. Also, there was a creek in Burton called the Wetzel Still Run, and I imagine they had also a distillery operation up there. Another reason to settle Brock's Gap was the timber. You'd need timber to build your nice snug log house like this one, and food, fireplace wood, and wood for your cooking fires. If you owned enough woodland, you could cut down the trees and make shingles and sell them at the store, or rails for your rail fences, and eventually you could send your lumber products to market at Broadway. But getting them there over the muddy road could be a problem. Bottomland, everybody was a farmer. No matter what your occupation was, somehow you had to have food. So the bottomlands along all these rivers and creeks was in big demand. Even the mountaintops had good farms because, and they made good farms. Like this one on the Shenandoah Mountain. And I just read a thing lately that they did grow the same kinds of crops on the mountain because it was cooler temperature. But they found out that rye and buckwheat and some other things grew very well, especially Irish potatoes, grew very well on the Shenandoah Mountain. When you study some of the old land surveys from the very first people coming in and grabbing all the good land, you see some really odd shapes. This one is Paul Custer's from 1767. The main part of the survey is the good land at Riverside Church. And then this tail is the bottom land along Lair's Run. So he was scooping up as much good land as he could get. Plentiful wildlife, of course, was a big draw. And you, of course, would think of food for your table, but also those furs and skins could be traded at the country store for other things that you might need or for cash money. Later, when the railroad came to Broadway, you could sell the whole animal, and they would ship the whole animal for food in the cities and towns. For instance, in 1877 at the Coutts store, the merchants there said that they had shipped 600 rabbits, 240 squirrels, 35 pheasants, and 81 partridges, plus all the skins and furs that they normally were shipping. Then Brock's Gap was the pathway to the west. Hard for me to imagine at first with all those mountains blocking the way, but there's a lot of passes that would let you go to the western counties, the Allegheny Mountains. For instance, the road to Overley Hollow up at Burton goes across the Shenandoah Mountain, and that was the main way to get out to the Allegheny Mountains. And the pathway to Cumberland, Maryland, even today, you don't have to cross over any steep mountains. You go on all the valleys and end up at Cumberland. And then that's also a gateway to Ohio and Pennsylvania. Some famous people took those trails, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Jed Hotchkiss was Stonewall Jackson's map maker. He visited the Gap before the Civil War in 1859. He was very impressed with what he saw. Water, romantic scenery, and German-speaking settlers. These settlers are still remembered today from the name Germany River that flows between Criders and Burton and is one of the tributaries of the North Fork. Brock's Gap residents had all they needed in the Gap, and lots of people said it was like a little world within itself. We kept our traditions and sayings for generations, even longer than they did out in the main part of the valley. The mountains made us feel secure, like you could tell from Ron's first photograph that you saw. And we feel so secure in Brock's Gap that we even have a saying for it, that when we go to Broadway or going to Harrisonburg, we say we're going out, or we're going out the way. But these German-speaking settlers weren't safe in the Gap in the 1750s when the French and Indian War came right to their door. This is a building, a house that's still standing. It's log under the siding, and today you can see the logs. It's Fort Hogg. Fort Hogg at Falk's Run was garrisoned by Virginia Regiment soldiers led by Captain Peter Hogg. The house is still standing, and I was told it was built from the logs of the palisade. Within the remembering time of Davy Foley and Nora Foley and some other older citizens when I was doing my oral history interviews, then they said that another log house stood right here beside this one, and that was a kitchen building in the time that they knew it. But that kitchen building had loopholes where they could shoot out at if they were attacked by the enemy. That made a big impression on all those people I talked to. In late 1757, the Indians did attack Brock's Gap, and they took 2 prisoners and killed 1 Dutch person, is how it was recorded. A few months later, they killed 2 men in Brock's Gap, and the next month they killed 1 more person. In April of 1758, Captain Hogg got word that his men were needed across the Pendleton Mountain in what's now Pendleton County. So he sent 18 men, led by Lieutenant Dunlap, over to Fort Upper Tract. The Indians attacked that month and overran Fort Upper Tract and killed everybody in the fort, including all those men who had lately been at Fort Hogg. The next day, the Indians attacked Fort Seibert, which you may be more familiar with. That was across one more mountain range. And they killed a lot of people, and they took a lot of people prisoner that day. The Gap settlers were so frightened and terrified over all this going on that they wrote a letter to the governor, and this still exists in the official minutes, that if they didn't get better protection from the government, they were going to have to move across the mountains to the east where they would be safer. By the 1760s, peace came, and that war was settled, and some prosperity followed until the next war. The American Revolutionary War didn't have fighting come right in Brock's Gap like the French and Indian War did, but a lot of families sent sons to the army and fought at places like Cowpens. My ancestor Michael Baker, whose tombstone is right here, actually it's a memorial stone, he was at the Battle of Cowpens along with Daniel Morgan and a lot of people from Winchester. These names that I have on the screen also provided produce for the army. They sold them bulls, or sold them cattle. They sold them hay, and they also let the horses come and pasture in their fields. Now, after the United States was established, the Gap started having famous visitors like this gentleman right here. Yes, George Washington did come right through Brock's Gap, and he spent the night in Brock's Gap with the Fitzwaters at the Burton Cutoff. He had been out at his western lands in western Pennsylvania, probably around where Jared's from, and he was probably pretty mad when he came back to the Gap because he found out that squatters were on his valuable land in western Pennsylvania. He would have come over the Shenandoah Mountain through Overley Hollow, down Arbuckle Road at Burton, and then downtown Burton, and crossed the river a couple times before he got to the Fitzwaters. He wrote in his diary that the road was pretty good, but it was awful rocky. Now, we didn't have organized churches yet, but traveling ministers did come and preach a lot of times in the homes and in the barns of our local settlers. Now, this has happened to me before. Let me do it this way. There we are. Okay. Okay, some of the famous ministers that came through. Francis Asbury is known as the American founder of the Methodist Church. He came through Brock's Gap and visited with Michael Baker, whose farm is the dairy farm that is it J. Smith and stuff. J. Smith owns now. That was the Michael Baker farm. So that's where Francis Asbury stopped to talk to the Bakers. Then Paul Hinkle, who was a famous Lutheran minister from Newmarket, came through Brock's Gap very frequently because he had a lot of preaching stations further west too. He spent the night with the Dove family pretty often and preached at their home. Christian Newcomer was one of the founders in the U.S. of the United Brethren Church. That church later became the EUB Church, which later merged to become the United Methodist. He came through Brock's Gap quite often. And in fact, the annual conference of the United Brethren Church was held at Crider's in the 1820s at Jacob Lance's house. And then since we're in Timberville and Broadway, most everybody here should have heard of Elder John Klein of Broadway. He had a lot of preaching stations in Brock's Gap. He spent the night with several different families. And he also was a doctor, and he doctored a lot of the families there, including some of my ancestors. And Debbie and Dolores' ancestor too, Jacob Ritchie. Now, the whole area was known as Brock's Gap for a long time, starting in the 1750s. When you read the first surveys of the area, they say, "Ye Gap in ye North Mountain." And then after a while, they start saying Brock's Gap. And then another record will say the Gap in the Mountain. And then finally, they settled on the name Brock's Gap. I think if you were a settler there in the early days, if you got any mail at all, you had to go to Harrisonburg to get it. Or your neighbor would be in Harrisonburg and bring your letters back to you. Back in 1826, Brock's Gap started to have a post office. It was at Isaac Riddle's house here near Chimney Rock. Now, if you read some of my books, early books closely, I wrote, we never had a post office named Brock's Gap. I was wrong because I found this later on. The reason I didn't know about it was it didn't stay at Isaac Riddle's very long because other men became postmasters at different times. And in 1858, Samuel Coots at Coots' store had the post office switched to his store, and they renamed it from Brock's Gap to Coots' store. So that's how that got its name. Now, the people that lived close to Chimney Rock, that wasn't too bad to go outside the Gap and get their mail. But if you were from Crider's or Burton area, that was a long way to go out to the actual Gap. So in 1850, Ulrich Wittig, who was a newcomer immigrant to the Burton area, he petitioned to have a post office started at what's now Burton. They named it Dovesville for the Dove family that had been there from at least the 1770s. And they had operated a mill and store and had other business operations. The post office, for some reason, stopped in 1866 after the Civil War, but then it started again in 1872 and kept going until 1923 with the name Dovesville. And that's the Wittig store where the post office started out. In 1923, the Postal Service said, "We're getting your mail mixed up with Covesville, Virginia. So we're going to change your name from Dovesville to something else." And I don't know who decided on the name, but they picked the name West Gap. The people there were not having anything to do with the name West Gap. They were already Brock's Gappers, and they didn't want to add another layer of Gap onto their identification because sometimes Brock's Gap people didn't have all the best reputation. That's another program, though. So within a year, Charles Souter, who was postmaster, came up with this name Bergton, which means mountain town. And in just 1 year after they became West Gap, they became Bergton. And it's been Bergton for just about 100 years now. The next Gap area to get a post office was Fox Run in 1873. Downtown Fox Run depended on whose store the post office was in. It started out in this log building, which was right next to Fox Run Elementary School, and it was just torn down maybe 3-4 years ago. Let's see. George Foley was the first postmaster. Then, before too long, the post office moved about a mile upstream to the mouth of Little Dry River. And it was in 3 different stores up there, a Falk store, and then this is Georgie Custer Falk. Her dad was postmaster in the white apartment building that's still there. That was the post office. And then Sam Kreider had it in the brick apartment building that's still there. And then in 1947, my dad, Garnet Turner, became postmaster. And he rented space in this little building here that was next to Custer Service Station. That was Pete and Elma Custer, and their store later became Max Superette. Then 2 years later, my dad's country store was built, and Fox Run Post Office moved to the corner of the store till 1972, I think, and then it moved up the road again toward Dry River, and now it's in the second location since it moved from my dad's store. Dovesville took in a big area all the way from the West Virginia line up the Shandell Mountain, this way and that way. So Riley Kreider decided that it would be more convenient if there was another post office and split up Dovesville, so to speak. So in 1880, the post office Kreider's was established. He had suggested the name Kreider Store, but the post office decided that just plain Kreider's would be good enough. His first post office location was his store that was at the foot of the lane that goes up to Kaplinger Cemetery. And then in 1891, he built this nice house, store, post office combination building where the post office has remained for 131 years. Now that takes care of the 3 existing post offices, Bergton, Kreider's, and Fox Run. But there were a number of extinct post offices, and we'll talk about those. And I'll pause at each one and we'll have a show of hands if you're from or have connections to these extinct post offices. Yankeetown, or Yankton, is the most mysterious one to me. It started, the community started in 1872 when investors from Connecticut bought 13,000 acres of land up in the Yankeetown area for lumber. And then they started this lumber town right there. By the time the post office was established in 1880, Yankton or Yankeetown had a hotel with a chandelier, 12 buildings like houses for their employees, a store, buildings for their operation too. It even had a tramway that went a couple miles into the mountain to bring out the logs that had been cut down. And they would bring them to the lumber camp there at Yankeetown and process them into shingles. They made up to 8,000 to 10,000 shingles a day, and then took them by wagon out to Broadway for sale. The business failed